Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins.
Hello and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Joy Dobbins, a registered dietitian nutritionist. And on this show, we delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition. And today's episode is about the future of food and why we fear the food we eat. We're going to touch on food trends, consumer behavior and perspectives, agriculture, critical thinking, and more. My guest today is one of my absolutely favorite speakers and a previous guest. His name is Jack Bobo, and he is a food futurist. He's the CEO of Futurity, a food foresight company that helps people understand trends in food technology and consumer attitudes. And Scientific American named Jack one of the 100 most influential people in biotechnology. That is so cool. Welcome to the show, Jack.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
I should say welcome back. So you were on the show a little over 3 years ago, which is hard to believe it was that long ago. It's still one of my favorite episodes, number 43, The Surprising Truth About Agriculture. I've seen you speak at a couple of conferences, and I've learned so much from you. And I share those learnings when I speak at conferences about sustainability and agriculture, especially the trade-off concept. You really taught me so much about that. And we might touch on that today because we've got some really interesting information to cover, kind of catching up on what you're working on and what's going on in your world now and the future of food. But before we jump into that, I wanted to ask you to share a little bit more about your background. You have quite a few credentials. You have a BA, a BS, an MS, and a JD. So that's kind of interesting and fun in and of itself. So tell me a little bit about your education and how you came to be such a thought leader and a speaker about food and agriculture and consumer behavior.
Well, I think my parents would say that I was indecisive, and that's how I ended up having all of these degrees. But, at one point I had thought about medical school, and I ended up with degrees in biology, chemistry, and psychology along the way. But then I veered off and I went into the Peace Corps, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Central Africa teaching science. And it was really there that I developed this passion for, how do we protect the forest? How do we make an impact on the planet? And so when I returned, I got a master's degree in environmental science and a degree in law. And I thought I would end up in the conservation environmental world. But when I went and worked for the U.S. Department of State, I ended up in the Food Policy Office. And it was there that it just, my eyes were open to the fact that the single biggest driver of global deforestation and other things was agriculture. And if I didn't find a way to help feed the people, then we wouldn't be able to address those drivers of deforestation. And so I realized just how intimately they were connected.
And you mentioned this journey partly in your TED Talk, which we're going to touch on. And so, yes, you definitely have this background and this experience with food policy, which I find very interesting. I think there's a lot there that we could probably do an entire show on that. But you've spoken in 50 countries around the world. And I know that Futurity is somewhat of a newer venture for you. So can you talk a little bit about what you do there and the projects that you work on and the services that you offer?
Yeah, so Futurity is a food foresight company. And so what I do is I work with small food tech startups all the way to big brands to help them think about what is the future of food technology, what are consumer attitudes and where are they going, and how do you get ahead of consumer trends so you don't get run over by them. As I've gone out and talked to different organizations, what I found is that there's a lot of angst in the food and agriculture world, that companies just don't really know what the future holds for them anymore. They don't know what consumers are going to want tomorrow. And they really are desperate to get somebody who can help them understand the trends that are beneath the trends that everybody else is talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. And it sounds like consumer attitudes and perceptions is part of what's underlying these trends. And I know that you work kind of in a few different pillars. You have training courses, and of course you have your speaking and are the types of projects that you work on. But if I had to have you kind of share your philosophy or your mission, what's the common theme here in everything that you're doing? What is driving you?
Yeah, I mean, if you went back to my time at the State Department or when I was working for a company before this, the mission that I guess I have is, how do we de-escalate this tension that's in the food conversation so that all of these people can get about the business of saving the planet in their own way? Because I tell people I'm a science optimist, but I'm a regulatory pessimist. I'm confident that science and technology can help us solve the challenges we face, but I'm not at all convinced that we'll be allowed to go there, because science tells us what we can do, but the public tells us what we should do. And so if we don't have that trust and that social license, then we're just not going to be able to implement the changes we need.
Mm-hmm. And that makes me think about the 3 pillars of sustainability. I recently did a keynote on sustainability at the Michigan Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And when we look at the 3 pillars, we have the economic aspects, the environmental aspects, and the social. So we've got the planet, the people, the profits. And I think so often we get so focused on just the environmental piece that we kind of zone out and we're not paying as much attention to the people or the social aspects or the economic and the profit word, like, oh my God, we can't profit. Well, if farmers don't profit, their farm won't be sustainable. They can't pass it down to future generations. But what do you say to people with regard to those 3 pillars and kind of where that balance is?
Yeah, and it's difficult. About a year ago, the World Wildlife Fund came out with a new report that talked about 60% of wildlife populations have disappeared just since 1970 alone. At the end of the report, though, they said that we're worried about just eliminating the forest by 2050, so we need to double down on conservation. We need to work even harder at conservation to protect these forests. And I read that and I thought, wait a minute, you just said in the report that 80% of deforestation is caused by agriculture, but all of your solutions are conservation. And for me, you can't build a fence high enough to keep hungry people out, nor should you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So if we focus on making sure that people are fed nutritiously and sustainably in the food they eat and produce, then nobody's going to be going in and cutting down the forest because they won't need to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, that gets to that point of, if people have livelihoods and they're fed, then the pressure on the natural environment decreases. So we'll get that result. It doesn't mean we don't focus or care about conservation, but we need to care about people being fed as well.
Right. Yeah. Having that delicate balance.
I don't really think of it as a delicate balance. I think of it as just choices and consequences. We can choose to try to protect the forest, but there will be consequences from that. In our last discussion, we probably talked about in Europe, they choose to produce food with fewer inputs and they try to reduce insecticide use and other things. And as a result, they can't feed themselves. And so they import 70% of their animal feed needs. The country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil. And Europe has exported its environmental footprint to the most biodiverse country on the planet. And so the choice of protecting the lands and the farms in Europe, the consequence is global deforestation.
Right. Yes. The whole concept of choices and consequences is, partly those trade-offs that you explained so well in our previous conversation. And yes, thank you for bringing that specific example. You talk about the next 30 years being the most important 30 years there will ever be. And I'll let you say it the way you say it, because I think this is also a concept that was new to me, that you introduced me to. And now the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance has their 30 Harvest docudrama. Not sure if you've seen it, but can you talk about this before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts of your TED Talk and some of those concepts that I want to share with the listeners? But why is the next 30 years so important? What's going on?
Yeah, so everybody's focused on population growth, and rightfully so. We're going to go from 7 to maybe 9 billion people by 2050. But what they're not focused on is the trajectory. Where are we going to go in 2100 or after that? And the reality is that we've already reached peak child. The number of children born this year is as many as will ever be born in any year going forward. So we're not actually having more children. We've kind of plateaued in that respect and will probably decline going forward. And so all of that population growth, 7 to 9 billion people, is because people are living longer. It's a good news story. But it's also the reason that population growth slows down and starts to reverse so quickly. And so people are very concerned about having to produce more and more food forever. But that's just not the case. We're going to have to produce more and more food for a short period of time. And then after that, every single year, things will get easier. So it's only this narrow window when it's really, really challenging. And that's why I encourage people to think about, these aren't problems that we have to keep solving forever. If we can solve it in the next 30 years, then we will have solved it forever.
Yeah. And I think that does change your outlook when you think, okay, is this just going to keep, like you said, that trajectory? Is it just going to keep getting harder and harder and harder? We certainly have our work cut out for us, but it does change the feel, certainly, and the understanding of the problem. And I always love how you talk about, kind of having all tools, all technology, innovation, but to your point, the science is one aspect, and then how people decide, like you said, well, just because we can do this, should we do this? How should this be done? And people are not robots. There's a lot of complexity going on with our thoughts and our feelings. And that leads me to your TED Talk, Why We Fear the Food We Eat. Kind of set the stage with, you already talked about your experience in Africa, but pull that in if that helps kind of set the stage here. What were you trying to achieve with this TED Talk, and how's it been received?
The thing that struck me perhaps most when I was working at the State Department and talking to people about food is that people have never been more afraid of the food they eat, and yet our food has never been safer in the history of the world. So in 10,000 years of human civilization, our food supply has never been more sustainable, more nutritious, more available, and safer, and yet people are still scared. And so that was something that I wanted to help people unpack a little bit. And part of the challenge is that we always use today as the baseline. And so if I were to tell you that 850 million people were going to bed hungry today, I think we would all think that's a tragedy. That's just totally unacceptable. And that's 12% of all the people on the planet are hungry. On the other hand, if I told you that 30 years ago, 24% of all the people on the planet would be going to bed hungry, and just 50 years ago, 1/3 of all the people on the planet would go to bed hungry, then all of a sudden, it's very different. Things are, 800 million is unacceptable, but it's a question of, are things bad and getting worse or good and getting better?
Are we moving in the right direction? And we are.
We are, but maybe not fast enough. But that's a very different problem, because if things are bad and getting worse, farmers are the problem to be solved. If things are getting better, but not fast enough, farmers are the solution to our problem.
Right. And you've said agriculture is getting better all the time, but people just don't know it. And that's kind of what you're trying to fill that gap. And it's not just a knowledge gap, but you can speak to that.
Yeah, a lot of it is just about baselines. People today are very concerned about consumption of dairy and beef and other things. And again, it has its contribution to climate change and obesity and other problems. But when you think about the environmental impact, in 1980, we used twice as much water to produce that same amount of beef. We released 40% more greenhouse gases to produce that pound of beef. And so by every single measure, we're doing wildly better. And that's something to keep in mind, because if we were to say that the only solution to these problems was for everybody to become vegan, or if we just eliminated food waste, we would solve these problems. And we should stop focusing on productivity. Productivity has become a bad word. What I would suggest is this thought experiment says, well, what happens if we get to 2050 and it turns out that still only 4% of people are vegan, or if it turns out that it was much more difficult to eliminate food waste than we thought? If we didn't focus at all on productivity, then we would have had to cut down those forests in order to produce the food to feed the people. On the other hand, let's imagine the opposite, that we focused intensively on productivity and we were able to double the amount of food. But let's say it turns out we don't actually need that food. Well, productivity doesn't mean you always have more. If you double productivity but you don't need food, that just means you have half the impact you would have had by producing the same amount of food. So if we get there and more people are vegan and we've reduced food waste and we've doubled productivity, then we'd have this much, much smaller footprint for agriculture. So there's no scenario in which productivity doesn't contribute to the improvement of the environment.
Right. And I think people often think about food surpluses and, well, we have too much food, we have too many calories, it's a distribution problem, but it's far more complex than that. And to your point, I saw this when I was working on my master's research on bovine growth hormone in cow's milk, is we can make more milk with fewer cows. It's better for the environment. It works that way as well with regard to productivity.
And if you think in terms of food waste, 40% of all food wasted happens post-consumer. And so if tomorrow we were to completely eliminate consumer food waste, well, that just means that you and I would buy 40% less food. And if we buy less food, people produce less food. So it's not as if magically 40% of food gets exported to people, in developing countries that can't afford it. So that's good for the environment not to produce and waste 40% of food, but it doesn't actually increase availability.
It doesn't feed those other people.
Yeah, because they don't have the money to buy the food. It's not that the food isn't available. It's a demand side problem, not a supply side problem.
Mm-hmm. And I am glad to hear and to see that the food waste aspect is becoming more of a part of the sustainability conversation, because I do think that people want to know, what can I do? Yes, I can drive my car less. I can bike to work. I can be more thoughtful about food waste. I can compost, things like that. But even like you said, one thing is not going to be the answer. It has to be, like you say, bringing everything to the table and all solutions and potential solutions.
Yeah, and a lot of this gets into the mental aspect of it and the behavioral aspects, of our dinner plate. Instead of just reducing the amount of food we throw away that, has gone past its best by date, how do we get it so that people put half as much food on their plate, or that restaurants serve us the right portion size instead of serving us more than we need because food's not the most expensive part of that restaurant's service.
Right. We have to get out of that more's value sort of concept. So you have a My Plate challenge. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, so something I've been trying to get going is this idea that, if you go into a restaurant, just as you said, we feel like it's good value when they give us lots of food. And I went into one restaurant for Father's Day, and a restaurant that's known for lots of food. And I got my plate, and I looked at it, and, I have to say I was a little disappointed because I had the steak and mashed potatoes and green beans, and it seemed a little small on the plate. And I thought, I figured they would give me more. But unlike most people, I brought another plate with me to the restaurant. And so I took out this 9-inch paper plate and I replated my food based on the proportions in the USDA My Plate. And when I did that, I realized, oh my God, it is 2 full meals. It entirely filled up the second plate. And I then took out my tape measure, which everybody carries, and the original plate was 15 inches wide and 10 inches deep. And that's why it didn't seem like much food, because it was such an enormous plate.
Oh my gosh. It was a platter.
Yeah, it was a platter. And so it was 2 full meals. So before I ever had a bite, I asked for the to-go bag. I packaged up my second meal, but I took before and after pictures, right? So my concept of a My Plate challenge is, you go into a restaurant, you take a photo of your meal, you replate it, and then you take a picture, and then you can share it on social media with the hashtag #MyPlateChallenge. It's not to shame the restaurant, because if I eat twice as much food as I need, that's bad for my health, and I've wasted food. On the other hand, if I get 2 meals, well, that's tremendous value, right? So what I want to do is to get people to think about it. And what many would say, or nutritionists say, just eat half your food and, save the rest. The problem is that we know human psychology. And if I only eat half the food on my plate, my brain is thinking, he didn't finish his meal. And 2 hours later, it's like, hey, we didn't finish our meal, so we should have a snack.
Yeah, we're finished when the plate is clean.
Exactly. And so, this idea of the My Plate Challenge is to encourage people to be thoughtful about it at the beginning of the meal instead of the end of the meal. Because, if you have a few bites left, you're like, oh, I don't want to throw it away, and it's not enough to take home. And, we just end up in this habit of overeating and mindlessly.
Right. It's hard to stop. But if you put half that food into the doggy bag before you eat, it's a lot easier psychologically. And when I was an outpatient dietitian, that is something that we would tell patients to try. Hey, you can't always say just split a meal with somebody. Maybe they don't want the same thing as you, or maybe you're dining alone, or, there's so many different scenarios. But yeah, it's a lot easier to take half ahead of time. And
well, one of the things our family does is that we never order 4 meals. I have 2 children. And so whenever we go to a restaurant, we always only order 3. I haven't ordered my own meal in a couple of years. But, there has never been a single time when we thought we don't have enough food.
Right.
We have almost always taken something home.
Right. That's a great hashtag My Plate Challenge.
Yeah. And part of it, though, is that psychological change, right? It's value when you get the right amount of food for a good price. It's not value when you get more than you need. And that's where I think that social dimension, if we can get kids today who are already taking pictures of their food to tag it and start to promote this idea of right sizing as a cultural movement. Because we're not going to convince people it's good for your health, so you should do it. What we're going to convince people is people will share your lunch or dinner photos if you have the My Plate Challenge on there, right? So that, because then you're part of a movement. We all want to feel a part of something.
Right. And that gets into some of the psychology that you touched on in your TED Talk. Is that what you would call cultural cognition? Like I'm part of, I'm fitting in with what's going on around me. Would that be fitting for that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have all of these different cultural pressures on us all the time that we're trying to meet. And if we can harness those cultural aspects or behavioral aspects to work for us instead of against us, then we end up losing weight or eating in a healthier manner without really trying. It just becomes part of what we do.
And everybody around us, right? So you talk a lot about the mental shortcuts and confirmation bias, which I talk about on the show all the time. But with confirmation bias, you say it has consequences. So can you speak to that?
Yeah. So in my TED Talk, I give an example that we tend to all come to any conversation with our personal beliefs. And I like to give an example of my own bias because I think it's helpful because it's easy to spot bias in others. It's really hard to spot that bias in ourselves. That's called the blind spot bias, of course. So now they have a name for that one too. So one of the things that I say is if I were to read an article that said organic agriculture is more nutritious than conventional agriculture, what would I do? I would ask, who are the authors, who funded the research, and what was their methodology? And those all seem like perfectly reasonable things to do. But if I read an article that said organic is less nutritious than conventional or just as nutritious, I'd probably just tweet it. And that's because it's consistent with what I believe. We need to recognize that when we disagree with something, we scratch the surface, we ask tough questions, we do all these reasonable things, but we don't do them when we agree with something. Mm-hmm. And you will always find a hole in some research paper or somebody who spent a summer on an organic farm. And we leave that article thinking the authors were biased instead of recognizing that we, in fact, were the ones who were biased.
Yeah, and I think part of that is because even though we know things are not black and white, it's so hard for us to see the gray. It's very unsettling.
It is. And that's where, the conversation these days about soda taxes is something that makes so much sense. It's like, who really needs a 48-ounce super big gulp soft drink? I was in law school and I remember people carrying these jugs of soda in and sitting them next to them. And so it makes sense that if obesity is at a 30-year high, that our soda consumption must be playing a really central role in that. Mm-hmm. And yet when you pull up the data on soda consumption, we're at a 30-year low for soda consumption.
Right.
And so if we're at a 30-year low, then it can't be the cause of the problem. Doesn't mean it's still not part of the problem. But if you spend your time and your energy and your resources going after something or implementing a policy that cannot solve the underlying problem, well, that's just time, energy, and resources that have been diverted from real solutions.
Right. Yes. And that goes back to the mental shortcuts that I mentioned earlier. We make these mental shortcuts partly because that's just the way our brains work and we have so many decisions to get through the day. That soda tax example is an example of when mental shortcuts can lead to policy changes that, like you said, it might seem really intuitive, but when you look at the data, it just doesn't add up.
Right. But then there are other behavioral interventions that we could adopt that would almost certainly improve our health. And so I'm sure that, everybody has gone into a restaurant where they get free refills. And I was talking to the vice president of one of these companies, and I asked him, how big are the cups you give people? And he said 21 ounces. And I asked, well, what would happen if you gave people who dine in the restaurant a 12-ounce cup? And he said, nothing. The refills are free. Nobody's going to care. And I said, yeah, but we know human behavior. People will go, they'll get their soda, they'll drink it, and they'll get a half a cup and leave. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter if it's 21 ounces or 12 ounces. And so just that simple act of offering a 12-ounce cup unless somebody asked for a larger one means they would give away less soda, and every single customer would have a more nutritious experience at that restaurant. Mm-hmm. Now, consumers aren't going to fight that. The restaurant chains aren't going to fight it because then they become part of the solution, not the problem. And so just an example of how one can shape our environment in a way that almost certainly would have positive repercussions, but definitely it wouldn't have any negative ones.
Yeah, I love that because here's just two stark examples. The size of the cup versus a soda tax and how our behaviors would respond to that as human beings, how we would respond to that, and the two completely different outcomes.
Not just the outcomes, but how people feel about them. Because people who drink soda and people who make soda really hate soda taxes. And so if you're going to have a policy that people hate, then they should really, really work. And, we don't have any data that shows that people have a more positive health and nutrition outcome from soda taxes. There's some evidence that you can change people's behavior, but if people don't actually end up healthier, then it's just a regressive tax.
Yeah. Well, as a side note, I like my diet soda, and I was like, why is diet soda being taxed? There's no sugar in there, but I digress. You also have some examples in your TED Talk about hazard and risk. And I talk about that a lot on the show, but I think you do a really great job of explaining it. Talk about risk and risk perception and where we might be overestimating or underestimating some of the risks in our lives.
Yeah. So when I was at the State Department, I spent a lot of time talking about risk. And risk from a regulator's perspective is hazard times your exposure equals your risk. And unfortunately, most of us are not hardwired to understand risk, that, we're really hardwired to understand that hazard. How dangerous is something? All I have to do is say something can cause cancer for you to believe it does cause cancer. Mm-hmm. And it really doesn't matter if I say, yeah, but your exposure is super low, therefore there's no risk. Once I say cancer, then there's just no going back. So I eventually realized instead of talking about hazard times exposure equals risk, that I should be talking about hazard times media exposure equals perception of risk.
Right.
And that's really what we're all dealing with. The more people hear about something, the more they worry about, which makes perfect sense, right? I mean, if a lot of people are talking about something as being a problem, then why wouldn't we worry about it? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there are all sorts of risky things in our environment. And if nobody talks about it, well, why should we worry about it? So these things make a lot of sense. We understand why it happens. But just because people are worried about it doesn't make it unsafe. And just because people aren't worried about it doesn't make it safe. And so how do we get people to focus on the things they really should worry about? And that's something that I think is really important. And that gets to the point I made earlier, that people have never been more scared of their food, and yet their food has never been safer. Mm-hmm. And I think that's tragic, that we worry so much about, safe food, that we don't get to enjoy it as much as we used to.
Right. Well, and that's really at the core of why I became a dietitian and why 20 years into my career, I realized that I was the guilt-free RD is, I want people to spend their energy where it matters and not worry when it isn't going to make a difference. Certainly, I don't want them to worry needlessly, not just worrying, but where are they putting their efforts? I want them to, look at the biggest ROI on their efforts and also to bring that enjoyment factor back into their lives. And that manifests itself in many different ways, whether it's somebody who is trying to watch their weight or somebody who has diabetes. There's a huge fear factor with that. But yeah, now as I'm into my career over 25 years now, it seems like the agriculture, the farming aspect, the labels, the free from labels, the marketing has really kind of gone more into that space now. So speaking of that, some of the stuff that you focus on with your company has to do with communicating trust and also transparency. Can you speak to that a little bit? Enlighten us there.
Let me give you an example on the bias point. We have a bias in favor of natural things, and we have a bias against man-made technology. And the problem with that is that while many natural things are wonderful, Ebola and Salmonella and Zika and all of those things are natural too. So just being natural doesn't actually equate to good. But because of that, people are often worried about things like preservatives in our foods, chemicals. And that also doesn't work because we're made of chemicals. And so you can't really just avoid chemicals. But the preservatives that are in our food, they're in there for a reason. We used to have real food safety issues in this country, and many countries still do. And food safety is still an issue in this country. And if we take out preservatives, we'll end up wasting more food, or we will make our food less safe. Those are the consequences of such a choice. But you talk about transparency and trust, and people are beginning to worry that having those products in their food demonstrates a lack of transparency on the part of those companies. And because of it, companies are trying to strip out the colorings and the preservatives and other things in order to gain that trust. And unfortunately, I don't think that's ever going to work. You're not going to remove enough things in order to gain trust, because at some point somebody gets sick, and they get sick, restaurants that have focused more on what they would term transparency, but less in terms of food safety. And then once you have one food safety outbreak, then, all of those other things you were doing, we're non-GMO or we're gluten-free or whatever, really turn out not to matter if people are just getting sick from, real foodborne diseases.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an existential threat to our food system, because if people don't trust our food, then we can't bring new innovations and things to the market that are going to help us reduce food waste, to make our food, last longer, to come up with new innovations that are going to be more sustainable. All of the underlying values that consumers hold are at risk because of our biases against certain types of products, generically.
Yeah, and it frustrates me, and I don't mean to criticize manufacturers, because they are in a terribly tough spot. They are selling food that, they have to sell what people want and what people will buy. But when they're pressured to take certain ingredients out of their food, even though they know those ingredients are safe, obviously the message is, oh, well, yeah, you're right, we better get that out of there. And I just don't know if that can ever change. But of course, if I had a magic wand, I would have, all of the food science people at those companies say, oh, we hear you and we understand why you think that should come out of the product, but here's why. It's safe and you don't need to worry. And I know that that is a dream fantasy, but...
Well, that's a little bit, though, what I'm working with clients, trying to help them to communicate to the public. So I think that there are ways of doing a better job of communicating than what we've done so far. And the stakes are really high. And so we have to find a way of helping people to understand that, again, that there are trade-offs, but that consumers, their attitudes are not as fixed, I think, as most people think. And that's what happens when you get below the trends, the headlines. And let me give you an example. So right now, a lot of people say that big companies are not very good at innovating. And there are reasons for that. They're large, they're slow, they're risk averse, they're indecisive. So there are lots of reasons why we may see more innovations coming from small food companies instead of large ones. But I think a lot of what's really happening is that consumers don't want innovation to come from big food companies. because innovation is about change. Change is scary. And if I'm going to try something new, I want to know that I trust the person selling it to me. And with a startup company, the values of the founder and the values of the company are one and the same. On the other hand, if a company has 50,000 employees, how can I know that each of them share my values? It's just not possible. And so I'd like to give this example. Imagine for a moment that Monsanto had created the Impossible Burger.
I don't mean to giggle.
Yes, well, I think we all know it would have failed. And every newspaper headline would have said, what were they thinking? Nobody will ever buy a GMO burger. Well, everybody would have agreed on what happened, and they would have all been wrong. Because what really happened is that consumers didn't want that kind of innovation from a large food or biotechnology company, right? So just because everybody agrees on what the trend or the story is doesn't mean they're right. Now, once you recognize that, though, then you look at things like Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, and you see what's happening with them in a slightly different light. And that's the reason that, when Impossible Foods was selling their product in upscale restaurants, in the DC area, like Founding Farmers, people loved it, and it was exciting, and it was new, and it was special. But the day they started selling them in 18,000 Burger Kings around the country, people started talking about them being ultra-processed. Well, they were ultra-processed when they were super expensive and hard to get. But people only cared about that whenever you had it commoditized and democratized. In other words, when average people could afford it, it was ultra-processed. But when rich people could get it, then it was, good for the planet. And so we tell different stories based on how we perceive the organization selling it to us. And that actually creates an opportunity, though, because people have multiple values they're trying to address at any given time. And by framing the conversation, we can focus on the values that matter to them perhaps most. And that gives us the ability sometimes to be able to shift that conversation. People aren't generally talking about the fact that, is there any food more ultra-processed than soy milk?
Right.
And yet that tends to get a pass, and it gets a pass for, different reasons that have very little to do with the technology that creates it and everything to do with the values of the people that are producing it and how they're perceived by the consumer.
Wow. Okay. That was a lot. And I'm so happy to hear that maybe my wave of magic wand dream has, might have some legs to it. And thank you for kind of articulating some of the nuances of why people think small is good and big is bad. It's so interesting to dive into consumer thoughts and perceptions and behaviors. I interviewed Jason Lusk on the show a while ago, and I was like, I think I missed my calling as an ag economist. He's like, you could always come and get your degree. I'm like, I might.
He's great.
Yeah, he's really doing some great, interesting work. Well, excellent. Is there anything else that you're working on now that you'd like to share with us, or anything that you wanted to kind of convey in the form of a kind of a parting message or takeaways?
Well, one of the things that I'm working on is I'm trying to take these ideas about the mental shortcuts and cognitive biases and heuristics, and going to be coming out very soon with a series of blog posts that address them, sort of take them one at a time. And so I'm really excited to be able to sort of put down some of these ideas in writing.
Excellent. I will definitely be following that. And people can follow you on Twitter. It's at Jack_A_Bobo. You're also on LinkedIn. I will put the link to your TED Talk in my show notes, and your website is futurityfood.com. And I do encourage that people follow you and stay tuned to what you're doing and what you're communicating out. Thank you so much for being on the show again and staying in touch with me over these years. I love following you and seeing what you're doing. And when I saw that you had your TED Talk, I was just overjoyed. So congratulations on that. It's an excellent talk. I loved it. And I look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
For everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind and with the future in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke.